start by making sure I know how to pronounce everybody's name?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and I guess it's also important to confirm sides. So, on the affirmative, is it Scion?
Cyan.
Cyan?
Yes.
Cyan
Like
and Logan?
Yes.
Logan, yeah.
It's a near rhyme. And is it Teddy?
Yeah.
And Carter?
Yeah.
Great. Well, Cyan, Logan, Teddy, and Carter, congratulations on making it to the Octofinals round of the Parley TOC. My name is Sasan. Your other esteemed judges are my new friend Zeb, my old friend Judy. Do you have any questions for us before we get started?
I guess no questions, just comments.
Sure.
Verbal PR and POIs are good. And then actually one question, is it cool if I do like off-time roadmaps and stuff?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Preferred, same, like verbal PMIs would work.
Yeah. Oh, and another question. Would you guys prefer me to stand up during my speech or
Whatever you want.
Yeah,
sit
no
down?
problem.
Yeah, whatever is gonna be the best way for you to give a speech.
Cool. Thank you.
Sounds good. Then with that said, off time. Hi, my name is Sai Patel. I'm the first affirmation speaker. Yeah. On time. Start. 3, 2, 1. Hello, judges and opponents. My name is Sai Patel, and I am here in strong affirmation of the resolution that this House regrets IMF bailouts. So first, let's talk about what IMF bailouts are. IMF bailouts are when the IMF offers loans to nations in crisis, and given that the recipient accepts certain terms that are like outlined by the IMF. They're essentially made to quote unquote like alleviate countries in crisis. The word regrets implies that we should look at historical examples to see if this does more harm than good, because regrets is looking at the past and seeing whether something is good or something is bad. With that said, we believe that the burden of the affirmation is to prove that IMF bailouts have had like a more negative impact than a positive one, and the burden of the negation is to prove the opposite, that IMF bailouts have had a more positive impact than a negative one. With that said, let's go into the first of our 3 advantages. All 3 advantages kind of sing the same song, but the first advantage is debt trapping. So first, what's happening right now? When countries fall into debt, IMF loans are offered, and they're simply small amounts of money in order to keep the economy afloat. However, they have incentives for the IMF, given that the IMF is able to implement certain policies in the country, and also the loans obviously must be paid back. There are 3 main issues with these loans. 1, that they're predatory, 2, that they don't solve the root cause of the issue within the country, and 3, that they're reinforcing. First, let's talk about the fact that they're predatory. Subpoint A is that the IMF asks for interest to all countries, either immediately or after the country reaches a certain GDP threshold. Subpoint B is that countries are forced to pay back the loan ASAP, or else they can solve the issues immediately. Otherwise, the loan interest rate kind of keeps rising. The sub-little I here is that IMF is run by international companies who prioritize the private sector to benefit their own fund. What does this mean? It means that the IMF, when they when they give a country money, they specifically target that money to be used towards the private sector in order to like benefit the benefactors that run the IMF. Meaning that the IMF is simply attempting to gain like hegemony in private sectors in other countries, as opposed to actually helping the country alleviate its crisis. See here is that this threat has been working across the globe. More than 80 countries owe the IMF money, including 40 African countries, because of the fact that like Africa has been struggling recently as a result of colonialism, and IMF has used this as a way to capitalize on the issues in Africa and simply get more money. There are 17 ongoing loan things right now, but a lot of these loans have ended, yet the countries still owe the IMF money and are working to pay it back. However, they obviously can't. And this brings us to the second point, which is that the IMF loans don't solve. Subpoint A here is that this is because the investment from the IMF loans go into the private sector. Subpoint B is that there's no strategy with the loans. The IMF gives no guidelines for the country on how to use them, and this also means that the IMF doesn't always give the country enough money in order to actually create change within the country. Subpoint C here is that it doesn't solve the root cause. In a lot of countries, corruption, war, and etc. are the reasons for the economic struggle within the country, yet the IMF doesn't care. They just are like, oh, we'll give you money, and because these countries are in crisis, they receive the money, but as a result, the government either takes it because of corruption, it's spent immediately on war, or there are other issues that prevent the country from immediately being able to pay it back. A good example of this is in Ukraine, where since the war has happened, the debt for the IMF from Ukraine has increased by 33% because of the fact that the IMF has been giving them money, and that Ukraine has been unable to pay them back because they're in a war. And as this war continues, the loan is only increasing, and the amount of money that Ukraine needs to owe is increasing as well. We can also see this in Rwanda, Argentina, Egypt, and dozens of other countries. But the third point here is that it's reinforcing. This is because in order for once the country has a bigger issue, they can't pay it back, and the loan just continually increases. So what a lot of countries actually do is they go back to the IMF and they ask them for even more money. Why? Because in a lot of these countries, corruption is very, very common, and the governments are able to embezzle money, and the IMF is obviously okay with that because the money that isn't embezzled by the government goes into the private sector and helps the benefactors of the IMF. This is why only 2 of 17 existing countries with IMF loans have spent more than what the IMF has given them, meaning that the other 15 have lost money from this IMF loan. And 0 out of 17 countries have a floor for social welfare programs that is high enough to sustain a population. With that said, let's go into the second argument of austerity measures. The first point here is that when the IMF issues a loan, they require the nation to implement certain fiscal policies. The second point here is that Human Rights Watch reports showed that the vast majority of bailouts includes measures to do 2 things. 1, decrease government spending, and 2, increase taxes on low and middle income citizens. This is why an IMF report and the IMF's own research shows that the IMF's policies are insufficient in reducing debt in countries. Judges, this is damning for my opponents because the IMF themselves admit that their loans don't help. So why don't they reduce the debt? There are 4 reasons for this. The first one is that there's a decrease in governmental investment, which means that there's less domestic development of industries. The second point here is that there's a decrease in infrastructure and investment and other things like that, which means unemployment rises. The third point here is that the IMF fails to address the issues that cause the bankruptcy. And the last point here is that the increased taxes on low income increases poverty, which strains every single system within the country. This is really, really bad because it means that the country is essentially terminally screwed because the situation is worse than it was before and they owe the IMF money. So what happens is that the countries become immediately lulled into a false sense of necessity where they feel like they need to immediately pay the loan back. And this leads them to defund social programs. And this is really, really bad because for every $1 defunded, for every $1 that the IMF gives a country, it actually takes away $4 times that amount from social programs. So we can see there's a direct correlation between the IMF giving them money and social programs going away. And social programs are key. According to Brookings, Wiley, and other sources, social programs are key to a country's economy, and without them, the economy gets stumped. This is because people putting money into the economy obviously helps it grow, and when people don't have social programs, they don't have that net, they fall into poverty, and this strains every single system. So what are the impacts of this? There are 2. One is immediate short-term death for many people because they fall into cyclical poverty, or the people who are already in poverty who are relying on food stamps to eat would already die. But the second point here is that it causes indefinite death for the country because the country now has no ability to get out of this loan cycle. They have no ability to repay their debt, and they can't ever move forward. Meaning that this country is essentially stuck in time where they can't make any progression and are essentially forced forever to be paying back debts to the IMF that they can't actually repay. And then the last point I'll summarize really quickly, which is that the IMF has bad incentives, which causes bad outcomes. It's because the IMF is run and managed by business executives, and they require the privatization of previously nationalized industries, which allows them to reap profits internationally from other countries. So they just fill their own pockets while the country suffers. And so, judges, because of those 3 reasons, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation. Thank you.
Okay. Quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to go top of case, so just over some framing stuff. Then I'll go over our case, and then I'll get to their case, because a lot of it's going to be from mine. Cool. If everyone's ready, I'll start it. Oh, yeah. Also, sorry. Well, brief introduction. My name is Teddy Sipkins. I use he, him pronouns. I'll be the first and speaker on the negation side. Ready? Cool. Begin in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Hello, judges. Just getting into the framework. On their framework specifically, we think they just don't address a major part of the resolution, being the word regrets, right? They tell you that we should look in the past, and we agree. But what they don't, but they essentially boil it down to IMF loans or bailouts have done more harm than good. What we tell you is that the word regrets here is key because it implies that we need to look at what a world would be like without IMF bailouts. So what we're doing in this debate is not talking about just whether or not IMF loans have caused more harm than good. What we're talking about is whether or not a world without IMF bailouts is better than a world with, is worse or better than a world without them. And so, because they just don't deal with what an actual world without it would look like, we think that we win this round, because none of their contentions actually deal with what would happen if the IMF bailouts just disappeared for the last like 3/4 of a century. But getting into it's just like, and so we agree with this. So like that's how we think you should evaluate the round, like net benefits on whether or not the IMF bailouts have like a world without the IMF bailouts is like worse or better than a world with IMF bailouts. We agree with their definition of IMF bailouts. It's just like the IMF giving loans with condition and like contingent on the terms being agreed upon to countries in an economic crisis. So like again, we just think they have to provide a world of what this would look like, and that's their burden of proof, proving that that's better than what we have. But without further ado, let's get into the negation case. So our first contention is going to, if there aren't any PFCs, so our first contention is going to be preventing economic collapse. So they basically tell you a lot about how, like, in the long term, economic bailouts from the IMF provide a lot of harm, right? Like, they make the situation worse off than they were before. But what we tell you is that the inherent point of bailouts, the inherent point of loans is like, sure, countries take on debt, but it's to give them breathing room to make changes and to make corrections in order to not face immediate economic collapse. We tell you that a world without IMF bailouts is a world where a lot of these countries in the last like 3/4 of a century immediately economically have an economic collapse right after, like, if the IMF doesn't give you these bailouts. Like, IMF lending gives countries breathing room to adjust policies in an orderly manner, paving the way for a stable economy and sustainable growth. Yes, countries need to take on interest. Yes, countries need to take on debt. But debt is postponable, right? Like, the US has a ton of debt. That doesn't mean the US isn't a good economy. We don't think debt is an indicator of being a bad economy. We don't think debt does all the stuff they talk about. We tell you that, like, being able to have spending money and being able to at least have money for the time when you're in the economic crisis gives you time to get out of the economic crisis. A world without IMF bailouts, which they don't even describe to you, they don't give you a method for how in this world we're going to see these countries not just immediately collapse. Like there's examples of this for like when the IMF was first founded after World War II, right? Like in 1956, the IMF helped save the Suez Canal, which like basically saved trade on a global scale. It saved Mexico in 1996, and like throughout the last 3/4 of a century, it saves like a ton of different countries that are crucial to world trade and that have a very prominent point in the global economy to this point. They mainly deal with like loans from like the past 20 or 25 years, like in the century. We tell you that the IMF has played a crucial role in making sure that the global economy has not collapsed in times of crises for the last 3/4 of a century, not just the 1/4 of a century that they talk about. Because the IMF gives room to breathe, gives room to make important economic decisions, even if it requires taking on debt, we tell you that the IMF allows for postponing of economic collapse. And when we postpone economic collapse, we tell you that we give you more solvency than they do for all of the problems they put forth. Like, the short-term debt gets way worse if there's just complete economic collapse, right? Like, the entire point of IMF bailouts is that the country is currently in a crazy economic crisis and that they need time to figure it out. We give them that time. They don't tell you what would happen if we didn't, and that's why we think you cast a negation ballot today. Like, again, Argentina has historically used loans to avoid collapse. Like, while it has debt, it currently isn't in an economic collapse because it has used loans. Like, massive IMF loan to the Pakistan just last year stopped an economic crisis from destroying its country. Again, like, Pakistan is still in the economic crisis, but it would have collapsed in 2023 if the IMF didn't give it this loan. Like, we're giving them time. That's the most important thing here. So all of their impacts about short-term death, short-term crashing, like, one, become much stronger, but two, in the long term, economic collapse, like on the level that would happen without IMF bailouts, is just such a bigger impact than anything they give you, because it set the stage for greater economic scaling and for greater relations in the long run. Because we gave countries more time, which allowed them to forge new trade bonds, which allowed them to forge a stronger economic basis that they now use to gain advantage today. So we have the long term and short term here. Our second contention is going to be about helping smaller countries. So smaller countries often don't have the resources to deal with crises like such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which makes it so like when they need more resources and when like things shut down, they don't have them, and the IMF provides for solvency there, right? Like, during COVID-19, countries like Chad, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, Ghana were all bailed out by the IMF during COVID. Without it, all of them would have collapsed by the end of the pandemic. This is key because with the IMF bailouts, we give you solvency here. Like again, these countries are still struggling, but they're not just done. That's key because the long-term impacts of IMF bailouts are simply just so much more powerful than anything they put forth. Because while the situation might even get slightly worse, it's not going to get what would happen. We need to look at what would happen if these bailouts were never given in the first place. They say, oh, the situation's all get worse all the time. We tell you that they would get a lot more worse if these bailouts weren't there. That's what they don't look at. That's why we think a negation ballot is key here. But let's look at their case now. So starting off with their first contention, which was basically debt trapped, right? So they talk about how they're predatory, ask for interest, prioritize the private sector, and countries have debt but they can't regain that. We tell you that one, like the conditions the IMF often puts on the loans do help with fiscal policy. Like they do help with setting up for long-term basis. Like that's the point. Like they say, oh, there's less government spending and more taxing as a whole, and on middle and lower class. But we tell you that there's also more taxing on upper class. We tell you that like as a whole, we just generally help ensure loans are predatory. But again, without the loans and without the bailouts, it would be way worse. Like at least predatory bailouts are way worse than nothing at all, right? Like going into debt and having interest is better than just not being able to is better than having no money at all in the long run because we give them breathing room. They talked about how IMF loans prioritize the private sector and it basically trying to gain private hegemony over these countries. But we tell you that that's largely not true, and that largely there's a massive amount of the member states of the IMF that pressure the private sectors to make actually good fiscal policy, which is the entire point of the conditions in the first place, to balance out to make it so there's good economic fiscal policy in the long term. Next, they talk about how it doesn't solve the root cause, and they say investment goes in the private sector and there's other root causes. Again, we tell you that bailouts give time to solve the root causes and also stop the consequences when they happen. Yes, root causes are always still a problem, but what they don't tell you is what these root causes aren't going to be solved if the IMF doesn't give bailouts, right? They don't provide uniqueness there. And then they talk about Ukraine, and they give Ukraine as an example, right? If there weren't IMF bailouts in Ukraine, the Russian-Ukrainian war would be over already because Ukraine's economy would have collapsed a year ago, right? This is an example. Next, they talk about austerity measures. We have to implement certain fiscal policy. We tell you that again, this is overall these conditions are a net good because while they are somewhat predatory, they result in the countries being to postpone. So because they don't engage in the resolution, we think you're casting the negation ballot today. Thank you.
Cool. So I'll give a quick overview. I'll talk about the framing and the top of case stuff. Could you give me the one sheet that had?
Oh yeah, it's at the bottom. Examples. This one?
Yeah. Do you need this, or do you want me to check it
No,
out?
no, you got it. You can take the bottom.
Okay, so it's overview, top of case.
Top of case and math in order. All right. My time. Sorry.
Could you guys say your contentions for me, please?
Sorry.
Could you say your contentions for
The
me?
taglines.
Yeah.
Debt trapping and austerity.
Austerity.
I think those are the two. Okay. My time begins. Now, judges, the overview for this round is that while our opponents claim that we don't construct a future for you in which the IMF didn't give their loans, they themselves fail to explain specifically how the loans actually contribute to positive fiscal policy or positive growth or giving breathing room or anything in regarding helping collapse. We tell you specifically that what the IMF does is prevent collapse. Yes, maybe, we don't even know, but just continue to issue loans so that they can continue to exploit these countries. In fact, we probably tell you that these countries would have done better to domestically produce their own industries, and if the IMF was involved, they would never be in these bad situations at all. So with that said, let's get into the top of case kind of framing. So my partner makes this claim about more harm than good, and our opponents kind of say that's not good enough. Let me contextualize this. The reason that we are going for more harm than good here, explaining why these IMF loans have caused more harm than good, is we are looking at the idea of if you were a country on the verge of crisis, would you want to take that loan or not? If it's going to cause more harm than just the status quo, that means that you would regret taking that loan in the long term. So effectively, we're on the same thing. But what they need to do is to prove to you specifically how these IMF loans have prevented collapse. Look at the economics, look at where the investment is going. We have done that, and we proved to you that it's not actually helping these countries. It's just stringing them along, continuing to exploit their people, having them be in conditions that's worse than a collapse, and overall just bad situations. So let's start with the debt trapping examples. They make a few responses here. The first is that the IMF's conditions do help. And they explain, oh, well, we also tax the upper class. Two responses here. The first one is absolutely no, they don't. The IMF researchers themselves admit that this does not help their economic policy. It increases debt in the long term while cutting like expenditures that people rely on for like their lives. They also tell you that they tax the upper class. Actually, no, they don't. The IMF implements a tax policy called regressive taxing, which means they tax the lower income people more than the high income people. Why did they do this? Because like people who are benefiting from the IMF, the people who run the IMF, are big business executives. This goes unrefuted from our opponents. They want big businesses to benefit from this multinational exploitation of these countries in crisis, so they don't tax high-income people. They tax the low-income people who are not even going to get jobs at these multinational companies. They also tell you that like this gives time, like breathing room to solve this root cause, and I'll talk about like that terminology a little later. But no, it actually doesn't. We give you this example of like Ukraine and Rwanda, and they say, oh, like this would help the Ukraine war. But we tell you like, another example is Rwanda. We tell you right now, Rwanda is spending IMF money to fund rebels in the Dominican Republic, or not Dominican Republic, sorry, DRC, and they're currently like exploiting the mines there and causing a huge chaos. And like, you know, the IMF has no fiscal policy, no guidelines to how these countries can spend the money. There's super high rates of corruption, and our opponents simply don't respond to this. They don't explain where the money is going, and the reason is because you can't explain it. If you try to explain it, it sounds really bad because it is really bad. Lastly, we talk about how countries are suffering, and they say that member states would pressure for good fiscal policy. The problem again here is that the IMF is funded by these Western countries who benefit from their own Western countries going into these countries in the global south, exploiting their resources and turning a huge profit. The incentives are not structured in the right way, which means our opponents can never be winning this round. On the austerity level, our opponents simply don't respond to a single one of these claims. First, we tell you that bad policy is hurting people. We tell you that this is inherently led to less domestic development, less jobs, and increased policy. And these are all metrics in terms of countries that were already in collapse. So we see countries that have huge unemployment rates. They can't even fund their own governments. And then the poverty goes even higher. This is like obviously really bad and not something that we want to be seeing. But this is further like supercharged by the fact that while these countries are in crisis, they're being exploited even further so that they will never get out of this crisis phase. For example, in Angola, the IMF forced them to privatize their water and electricity. In Honduras, they had to privatize their water and sewage. In Panama, they had to allow for foreign mining to take place. And in Niger, guess what? They had to allow them to extract foreign oil. The oil was nationalized, which was helping the government like restabilize themselves. And then the IMF came and said, here, like, you know, corrupt individuals in the government, you can have a bunch of money if you just let us like have all of your oil resources. That's obviously really bad for the long-term stability of countries, and that's why like you should be voting for the affirmation side in today's debate. So now let's get on to some responses on our opponent's case. The main idea and the main overview for the responses here is that they don't explain how economic collapse is prevented. They give you this terminology of like giving breathing room. This like comes directly from the IMF website. We like visited it in prep too. But the reason that they have this like vague terminology is because there is no specific plan to prevent collapse in these countries. They tell you that like debt is postponable, but the problem is that the IMF doesn't make it postponable. Our opponents don't respond to the claims that my partner makes about how they continue to gradually increase interest rates, meaning that like these countries will be screwed forever if they can never pay back this interest because like nobody's going to invest in that country if they know economic collapse is imminent in another 10 years. They tell you that the IMF saved the Suez Canal and that like its critical role in protecting the global economies. But again, these are just words. They haven't explained anywhere how like this money is actually helping the people in these countries to escape from poverty and escape from collapse. Like the Suez Canal is an infrastructure project, and that like helps, you know, shipping companies and helps, you know, Western companies who benefit from like exporting oil and things like that. It's not actually helping the people of these countries who are in crisis and who are suffering. They tell you that Argentina has historically used these loans in order to like repeatedly gain out of crisis. But this is probably like a warrant in itself for the affirmative side, because if Argentina keeps having to go and get more and more loans, falling into collapse and then getting a loan and then falling into collapse again, that's probably worse than if they were just able to naturally and domestically produce their own economy to like gain out of this in the long term. They give you this example of Pakistan, but we tell you right now in Pakistan there are protests against the IMF's austerity policies because people cannot afford food in the grocery stores. This is like a thing that's actually happening right now. So we tell you like the situation was bad and it got worse because people are starving on the streets and they have to go out and protest because the IMF's policy was so bad. I'll take the POI at the end of the sheet. They tell you that economic collapse has been worse, but we tell you no, because what the IMF is doing is putting these countries in a constant state of collapse, where they are funding wars, funding corruption, having their domestic resources be exploited, so that there is never a future for them to be out of a state of collapse. That is a terminally bad outcome, and you can't be voting for it. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
How would Argentina have stopped the complete economic collapse without IMF bailouts?
Yeah, so countries have economic collapse, and then they revitalize themselves based on domestic production. That happens all the time. And so what we're telling you is a state of constant crisis is infinitely worse. Constant crisis for decades and decades is infinitely worse than a one-time crisis, especially to the point where we tell you, and we read you statistics that tell you poverty rates get even worse than the crisis state once the IMF loans come in.
The UK just rebounded, Japan's rebounding right now.
Yeah, many countries are rebounding from economic collapse, or near the brink of economic collapse. That happens all the time. Okay, they also tell you about helping small countries, and the IMF provides solvency for these countries that would be in collapse. But again, the main point here is they don't give you any analysis of the way that this happens. They don't talk about where the investment's going, and the reason is because for the most part, it's going to bribe these corrupt leaders so that they can change their fiscal policy and then be exploited even further. These countries, whether or not they would collapse is up in the air. But certainly, if they didn't take these IMF loans, they would not be in a constant state of collapse where they can never recover. So because these loans are causing huge damage across the world, and our opponents give you no analysis as to the positive impacts that they could have, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation side. Thank you.
Okay. So, for a brief introduction, hi, my name is Carter Mitchell, and I am the second negation speaker for the and I'll get into that, okay. Okay, starting on my first word, starting now. Hello, judges, my name is Carter Mitchell, and I am the second speaker for the resolution that this House regrets IMF bailout. I'm on the negation. So first off, I'm gonna go through some of the framework issues, and then I'm gonna go into talking about all the points made on the affirmative, and then I'm gonna go into some of their counter-refutations, and then just solidifying our points. Okay, so first off, let's talk about this framework issue. They say that we don't provide any examples of where bailouts aren't a reason. Then they say that we don't provide in a world historically why bailouts have been a good thing. But what we proved to you in my first speakers, our whole case is about how bailouts are good because they haven't caused economic collapse as a whole in any of the countries supported by IMF. The reason why they say this hasn't worked or this hasn't proved anything is because we haven't seen any country just completely have economic collapse, because IMF bailouts have helped them in many ways, as we say in our first and second contention, because it is preventing economic collapse. Okay. So quickly, just going on to their case. So first off, they talk about this idea of debt trapping, and in response to this, we talk about how they say that the economic collapse is prevented because they talk about how implements policies and all these predatory things. But what we say to that is economic collapse is prevented because it is postponed. They reference the IMF website bailout, and they say that they even themselves say that bailout doesn't that they can't increase economic efficiency. But what we say to that is that the IMF bailout is something to help you postpone complete economic collapse. That is something that is crucial here. What the IMF bailout is supposed to do is to stop complete economic collapse.
Can you explain what complete economic collapse looks like?
Losing all of these things that you talk about, completely getting rid of. What does economic bailout mean? Just means you are completely out of money. You are completely in collapse. What we are preventing is economic collapse. Yeah. Anyways, so not only that, moving on to the second point, talking about austerity. We say that they say that it's a private sector and that they don't have that they don't have enough money. And they talk about all of these social programs. But what we say to that is you can't have social programs if you are in economic collapse. You can't have all of these positive things that they talk about when you are in economic collapse. They haven't proven to you why a world without IMF is going to lead to countries not completely having economic collapse. And we do prove to you that, wow, sure, there are some bad things that happen in IMF. At least we are stopping complete economic collapse, which is a extremely harmful for these places and would lead to all of these issues being even worse than they talk about. All of their examples, including Ukraine, all of their examples, like even when they try to cross-apply this idea of Argentina, would be much worse without IMS. Yes, you can come up here and critique all of the things happening with IMS, but if you cannot prove to us why an alternative world would be any better, the affirmative cannot win this debate, and they haven't proved to you why an alternative world can be any better, or a world where without IMF would not have led to like these economic imbalances. Okay. So quickly, going over what they say against our speech. So in response to our first contention, which talks about like preventing economic collapse, they say that like they bring up this idea of like regressive taxing, and they bring up this idea of like Rwanda and exploitation. So one, I want to bring up this idea about like Rwanda and exploitation. They first say that like there are no guidelines behind like how IMF is used in other countries, but then they also say that IMF is too rigid. So there's kind of a contradiction within this point. Is IMF too rigid, or is IMF not doing enough? We don't understand that here, but actually IMF does have particular guidelines, and we say in our first contention that these guidelines are used to help the fiscal betterment of these countries. It's to help countries. They say that like it's not to help countries, but what we prove to you is that in the decades before, no thank you, in the decades before, we like other examples that they haven't used that haven't been from the last 10 years, we see that it actually has been helpful. We see this in our 1996 example of Mexico. We see this in our 1958 example of the Suez Canal trade. It has helped, and even in these more recent examples, it has helped, and it has tried to form some kind of like fiscal imbalance. Okay, so next I talk about like regressive taxing and like how it's only for the upper class, but it's only taxing like the lower class. But what we say to that is like, one, they are still taxing the upper class, and two, it's something that is happening. There is some sort of measure being taken to prevent from complete economic collapse. They don't prove to you like why this measure is like why a world without these measures are good things, and that is why they once again cannot win this debate. Okay, moving on to our second contention, which talks about like how helping smaller countries. In response to that, they say like that will be in more and more loans. Once again, I want to prove something that my first speaker Teddy says is just because a country has loans doesn't mean that their economy isn't good. We say that it doesn't necessarily mean that their economy isn't good. What we say to that is the U.S. isn't in ton of debt right now, but that doesn't mean our economy isn't good. You can still be in debt but still have a good economy. Next, they talk about this idea of like bribing corrupt leaders in our case, but I cross-apply that is like once again they bring up this example of it being having too many guidelines, but also like not having enough guidelines. So this example of like bribing corrupt leaders, it kind of doesn't work if they're going to also say that like it has no guidelines in the Rwanda example. Okay. Moving on to our example about Argentina. So in response to our Argentina example, they say that like we haven't revitalized, how it's done all these bad things, and like that Argentina, if in a world without IMF, Argentina could have revitalized by like just making more money or working with the market. But what we say to that is if Argentina, with already getting help, with already having a bailout, is still not being able to get back to economic prosperity, what makes you think that without this money, they could just magically have like this new market and new economy and start to flourish? So even with IMF, if they're still struggling, we prove to you that like even with IMF, if they're still struggling without IMF, it would have been so much worse. Okay, so think quickly. Quickly going over our first and second contention again. I just want to prove to you, let's talk about like preventing economic collapse. They're obviously going to come up here and try to say that we haven't proven to you why the IMF specifically prevents economic collapse. And what I want to say to that is how we have seen that the IMF has prevented economic collapse is that we have not seen a country that has been supported by IMF have just complete economic collapse. And what I mean by that is we haven't seen all of these programs and all these services completely just demolished because they don't have money to pay for anything. We bring up these examples of in COVID and all of these differing examples of like in a time where they haven't been able to, like, where the world has had major issues, they have been able to not have complete economic collapse. They have not been left alone. Then we bring up like this idea of like this massive loan to Pakistan, and they say in response to that this has led to more issues, but what they don't prove is like how in a world without IMF these issues still wouldn't persist. And again, in our second contention, which talks about like helping smaller countries, we say to you that like it is helping smaller countries. Sure, again, there are some negatives with IMF, but they have not proven to you in a world without IMF why any of these problems would be any better. And that is why the negation.
quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to go into the framework, then I'll go over aff case, then I'll go over neg case, then I'll go over neg case, and then it'll be main throughout. Cool. Everyone ready? Cool. Begin in 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's start on framework because you cast your ballot here. They don't engage with the actual motion. They simply believe that the motions like the IMF bailouts have done more harm than good. It's not. Don't let them tell you it is because the motion is specifically that whether or not we regret IMF bailouts. And the word regret implies that we have to, the affirmation has to give you a world in which IMF bailouts don't happen. They don't. The only time they even mention what would happen without IMF bailouts is when they're refuting our case. But on their entire case, they have literally no arguments about what would happen without IMF bailouts. They just tell you why IMF bailouts have caused harm. It doesn't even matter if there's way more harm caused by IMF bailouts because as long as in this world without IMF bailouts, there would be more harm, we tell you that we win this round. Because they don't engage with a world what a world would look like if we didn't have it, we think you should cast your ballot here because they give you no offense there. But next, onto their case. They tell you, so for their debt trap argument, they basically respond to some stuff we said, but they don't respond to the key argument here, which is that debt isn't inherently bad. This goes completely dropped in their second speech. And because it goes dropped, do not let their third speaker come up and make any argument against it. Because they dropped this point, because we proved to you that debt isn't inherently a bad thing, and that debt, while not great, could provide still a basis for a country to economically thrive off of, for example, the US, right? We tell you that overall, debt is not a bad thing. This impact just does not stick. Next, on their austerity contention, they tell you that there's just we have to implement certain fiscal, there's guidelines, but they also, like Carter said, they tell you that there's guidelines, but there's also not guidelines, and they're really just confusing here. What we tell you is that there are a few guidelines, key guidelines, that lead to people not being in a total state of collapse. They just kind of say, oh, well, these guidelines don't actually solve the root problem. But we tell you that they largely do. And again, they largely prevent the consequences from taking place. They tell you that we don't give you an example of how, we don't give you proof that it gives breathing room, but we do. The simple fact that we're just giving them money and that they didn't have money and now they do have money and that having money is better than not having money and that even if you're in debt, even if you are in debt, having money is a basis to make more money. We tell you that, and if you have $0, you can't turn that into more money. We tell you that giving loans and giving bailouts is the only way to make sure total economic collapse doesn't happen. They tell you oh, it's probably good for us to collapse and then build back up, but we tell you that's not what happens because when total collapse happens, all we see is that they aren't able to rebuild because they have nothing to rebuild with. With a loan, they have debt, but they still have resources to rebuild with. That's the key argument in this round. That's what they drop. Next, let's go on to our case, where we tell you that, really quickly on their privatization thing, we tell, and benefiting Western countries thing, we tell you that, as a whole, again, they don't, as a whole, it's largely beneficial to the countries, which is why we haven't seen these total economic collapses. They say, oh, it's not beneficial, but and that the situation gets worse. But we tell you that it doesn't get, that sure, it might get a little worse, but again, that's not what this debate about. Debate is about. This debate is about whether or not it would get worse than what it happened if we didn't have the IMF bailout. Quickly on our case. We tell you that historically the IMF has saved us from complete global economic collapse. This goes drop. We tell you back from 1950 that the IMF has set us up for success and that the reason we don't have just complete economic collapse globally is because the IMF. Because they only deal in the last 25 years and don't deal with 75 years ago, which is the basis for everything we have now, we tell you that we win here. Again, this goes drop. Don't let them respond to it in their last speech. We tell you that smaller countries have been helped by this, that because they're able to postpone, because they have resources during crisis. We tell you that as a whole, historically, the IMF has helped. And historically, without IMF bailouts, we would be much worse off. And that's what you vote off here, because they just don't respond to any of it. For these reasons and more, please cast a negation ballot. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. For an off-time roadmap, you can flow this on a new sheet. I'll go overview and then kind of big questions of the round. I'm not going to do any line by line, so we'll do big questions, and then I'll just go into possible negation acts. Yeah. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Judges, the affirmation has already won today's debate because the negation has failed to uphold their verdict. Why? Because they don't tell you what the IMF actually does. In order to resolve who wins today's debate, we must resolve two things. One, what does economic collapse look like? And two, what actually happens when the IMF gives a country a loan? First, what is collapse? Judges, collapse is when the people of a country are rioting on the streets because they can't afford the food in their grocery stores. Judges, collapse is when a country is screwed indefinitely because they can't put any money into social programs. Collapse is when poverty and unemployment is at an all-time high and then it gets higher. Collapse is exactly what happens when the IMF gives a country a loan. Now, what actually happens when the IMF gives a country a loan? Well, we see that my opponents can't tell you. They say, oh, they get more breathing room. Oh, they avoid economic collapse. One, it is obvious that they don't avoid economic collapse because a lot of those countries are in economic collapse right now. But number two, they don't actually give the country breathing room. They give them a false sense of security, but in reality, they put them in a cage indefinitely, where they no longer can get out. Because the IMF makes it so they no longer have any money to spend on social programs and other things because they have to spend their entire savings paying the IMF back. That is why my opponents bring up the idea of Argentina, yet Argentina is in an economic collapse. It's because my opponents can't pinpoint any example of when this actually works. And it's why my opponents don't refute the study that me and my partner both bring up, where the IMF themselves tell you that their loans don't help the countries. The IMF themselves says that the loans don't do a good job at decreasing debt and actually lifting a country out of economic crisis. So my opponents can point to as many cherry-picked examples as they want, of which there are two that are both like Western incentives, but the reality is these IMF loans don't work. So now why has the affirmation already won today's debate, and what are possible negation outs? The affirmation has already won because we've proven that the IMF hurts countries, meaning that the worst case for the affirmation is still better than the status quo. Because if you leave a country on its own, sometimes it'll fall into poverty or in economic collapse. Sometimes it won't. Like my partner tells you, that there are countries all the time who go onto the brink of economic collapse and then come out, like England and Japan is doing right now. And sure, some countries may fall into poverty, but the IMF ensures that they do and ensures that they can never get out. That is the key. Judges, the IMF puts countries onto death row because they are sitting in a place where they can no longer get out. And of course, when you're on death row, you're going to regret the action that put you into that cell in the first place. And that's exactly what taking the IMF loan is. So what are possible outs for my opponents? The first thing is that debt actually isn't bad. Judges, debt is obviously bad. Why? Because you have to pay the IMF back. Because the IMF will continue to take and take if they're not paid back. This is why we see the privatization of loans. And my opponents say that, oh, the US is different. Well, this is because the US has a different interest rate. And also because they're part of the West, which are the countries that are part of the IMF, right? It's obvious that a body that doesn't like you is a body that you owe money to. Things are not going to go well.
Interest rates keep going up.
Yeah, exactly. And also, my opponents don't respond to the point that the interest rates of these IMF loans keep going up, meaning that the amount of money that they owe just stacks and stacks upon itself. The second argument is about guidelines, but the guidelines are very clear. The IMF has strict guidelines in requiring the privatization of industries, which is what has caused so many of these country examples that my partner tells you about, like Pakistan, about many other countries, but it is not strict about what the government can do with the money that it gets, which is why in Rwanda they're funding rebels to fight in the DRC. It's because the IMF has incentives, and they make sure that those incentives are met, and then they don't care about what else happens because they don't actually care about helping the country. And the third point is about Mexico and the Suez Canal. Again, two obvious responses here. One, they're cherry-picked examples. And if they have to go all the way back to 1956 and not look at a country in order to find their second example, it's probably obvious that the IMF isn't doing good. But also, there are Western motives for the people who are funding the IMF to help the Suez Canal and to help Mexico because it's next to the United States. So, it is very, very clear that the IMF loans are bad. My opponents essentially agree. They say that IMF loans are predatory and we're just delaying the inevitable. But judges, they are delaying the inevitable indefinitely, which means the affirmation outweighs the negation no matter how you look at it. Because a country in crisis, even in the worst possible crisis, is still in a better state than a country in a crisis where they can never get out. The IMF essentially wipes countries off the map, and my opponents concede that. And for that reason, you have to be voting for the affirmation today. Thank you.
Great round.
Good job, guys.
I'll go possible.
Thank you for this.
Yeah, thanks so much, judges.
All right, yeah, hey, congratulations.